Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for today, which is April 20th, 2021. And I'm going to be reporting on the building of a global anti-Malthusian movement to shut down the Green New Deal, to expose the fraudulent so-called science behind it, and to launch a full-scale plan for global economic reconstruction as opposed to deindustrialization and going backwards, as we describe in our famous pamphlet, The Great Leap Backwards, which exposes fully the intent behind the Green New Deal. Now, I'm going to start with two examples of the economic side of this, the global side of it, both of which reflect the influence of Lyndon LaRouche, who wrote the famous work, There Are No Limits to Growth, to counter the insanity coming out of MIT, the Club of Rome, various sorts of environmentalist groups, the World Wildlife Fund, Prince Philip, the recently passed away unlamented figure who is really the godfather of modern environmentalism. To counter them, LaRouche wrote an article, or a book rather, which explains why the idea of limits to growth is incompetent scientifically, philosophically, and economically. And now we're seeing reflections of that appearing in, of all places, China. The Global Times, for example, has an article on the John Kerry's effort to bring China to the Earth Day summit that President Biden is sponsoring. And what it says is that U.S.-Chinese cooperation is important. But while the U.S. wants cooperation on climate, it's moving to obstruct China in other areas. They didn't mention the particular areas, but the U.S. is trying to shut down the Belt and Road Initiative, which is an effort to bring development to some of the poorest countries in the world, including in Africa. Countries that have been redlined by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank so that they can't get any credit for production. So the Chinese go on and say it doesn't make sense to want cooperation in one area and not in others, such as economic development. They write that developing countries need further industrialization to improve people's living standards. They need to create more resources, not squeeze developing countries. This is precisely what LaRouche has been arguing for years, that new resources are a product of an increased population with an emphasis on the creative potential being developed of every single citizen. That's what increases productivity. That's what provides the basis of scientific discoveries, and scientific discoveries being translated into new technologies, which increase the productivity. And an increase in productivity in one area of the economy, especially if it's based on energy flux density, will have an effect throughout the whole economy of increasing productivity. Now, this idea that that it's wrong to demand the developing sectors give up development, give up industrialization because of the so-called carbon problem, this is a problem John Kerry ran into in India, where the Indian energy minister said that 800 million people in Africa need and want development. And then when he went to Prime Minister Modi, Modi said the same thing. The Indians essentially said they're not going to go along with an anti-technology, zero carbon policy, which shuts down development of countries that need to be developed. Now, similarly, there was a very interesting report from the People's Bank of China. Think about the difference between this group, this banking network, compared to the bankers in the West who have agreed to go along with cutting credit to any company that has a carbon footprint. That is, there's a compact that was organized by Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England, working together with Fink from BlackRock and Moynihan from Bank of America, with Davos, with Klaus Schwab and others, who say that credit should not be made available to any company that's engaged in industrial production that produces a carbon footprint. Only those companies that are doing things that are in line with sustainable energy development should get credit. So they're talking about limiting or cutting off credit to any company which would develop. Now here's what the People's Bank of China said in a recent report. They said China needs more people. They said that the old policy they had of the one child was discarded because it was a bad policy. They said it was based on the belief that resources are limited. Now they understand that resources are not limited, and each individual is an enrichment to the whole society. That's LaRouche's argument from the 1970s and 80s in his attempt to counter the globalists who were pushing for so-called environmental restrictions on development. So the idea that Lynn had in this is that what's limited is imagination. What's limited is the oligarchy attempting to prevent creativity from playing a role, unless that creativity is a way to figure out how to kill more people. So the dividing line on climate is real development, which, by the way, as you increase the burning temperatures of your industrial processes, you reduce the amount of pollution. We've seen that in the West. But when you go backwards to less energy-intense sources, you end up with people needing to burn down forests to provide for any kind of heat or power at all. So the opposite effect is accomplished by those who would limit development of nuclear power, clean coal, and so on. Now, where does this come from? Let's just take a look at Earth Day, which in some, I think Earth Day is technically tomorrow. It originally started April 22nd, 1970, and it was initiated by a senator from Wisconsin, Gaylord Nelson, who was generally known as an anti-war progressive. But on this question, he was a rabid follower of Malthus, someone who believed that population is the greatest threat, or population growth is the greatest threat to the planet. Later in his life, well, he was responsible for setting up the teach-ins in 1970 that were the beginnings of Earth Day, to brainwash young college students, forget about civil rights, forget about the Vietnam War. The most important issue is environmental concern. And this was funded heavily by what? Young students? No, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Agnelli Foundation in Italy. It was funded by the Club of Rome networks. It was funded by the various groups that funded the World Wildlife Foundation, money coming from British trust resources and so on, to convince young students that the cause of the problems in the world is too many people. And so what Nelson said in initiating it is that we need to get a nationwide demonstration of concern to force this issue permanently onto the national political agenda. And because of the support from media, the support from left liberal networks, and increasingly from some of the conservative, conservation-oriented libertarians, the idea of Earth Day, the idea of environmentalism became the dominant idea in much of society. But Nelson, as he aged and before his death, looked back on this movement and lamented the fact that it failed to address this question that he said is the most serious, which is population growth. He said, if we don't reduce population here, meaning the United States, and this is a quote, we'll join the less industrialized nations as a nation of degraded, overpopulated lands, unquote. And he said, this is not just a third world problem, this is a problem in the United States. In a 2002 book titled Beyond Earth Day, he wrote that talk of overpopulation should not be muzzled by McCarthyism or any other demagogic contrivance. That is that, he said, the failure to have the discussion about limiting population was due to political correctness. Now today, it's completely flipped. McCarthyism is directed at the courageous scientists who point out the fraud in the arguments that the world is overpopulated and that man is the cause of so-called climate change. People who point that out are accused of climate denial, that is, equating the fight for true science with the denial of the Holocaust. That's the form of McCarthyism that now dominates discussion of the environment. Fortunately, there's still a number of scientists, courageous scientists, actually real scientists, who debunk the mythologies of the population growth cause of problems, including people like William Happer from Princeton, and many, many people who worked with the LaRouche organization years ago in the Fusion Energy Foundation, who endorsed LaRouche's idea that we need more people to create new, more resources, as opposed to fewer people to engage in a Hobbesian battle of the jungle for survival of the fittest. Our view is that it's creativity that characterizes the nature of man, not the ability to build a military machine to steal resources from other people while limiting their prospects for development. That's what we should think about on this so-called Earth Day, and instead, the Schiller Institute has proposed that we instead look to Mars Day, where we celebrate the accomplishment within the last 48 hours of a helicopter, a man-made helicopter, taking off on Mars and flying, an accomplishment of NASA. So that's my report for today, and I'll see you again tomorrow.